One chapel in Axum, one guardian monk, one report that broke a 3,000-year silence. That's all it took. A single account, reportedly leaked through a network of Ethiopian Orthodox clergy and independent researchers, circulating in early 2026, claiming that something had changed inside the Chapel of the Tablet in Axum, Ethiopia. Not the kind of change you notice from the outside. The tin roof still catches the midday glare the same way it always has. The incense still seeps under the doors, that same dense, centuries-old mixture of frankincense and cedar that hangs in the air like a warning. But according to sources who claimed proximity to the monastery grounds, something had shifted. Something sealed for longer than most civilizations have existed was allegedly no longer sealed in quite the same way. The reports were fragmentary, contradictory even. No cameras, no press access, no independent verification. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which has maintained exclusive custody of what it identifies as the Ark of the Covenant for well over a millennium, said nothing publicly. They rarely do. That silence, to some observers, was more telling than any statement could have been. What followed was something scholars and theologians and archaeologists have never experienced before. Not an announcement, not a press conference, just a wave of stunned, hushed conversations spreading through academic circles and religious communities simultaneously. Historians who had spent decades dismissing the Ethiopian claim as folklore found themselves unsettled. Clergy who had never questioned the tradition found themselves searching for words they didn't have. And the experts? The ones who built careers on certainty? According to multiple accounts, they went quiet. Completely quiet. The kind of silence that only happens when something disturbing lands in front of people who thought they already knew the answer. Stay with me. Because what allegedly happened in Axum in 2026, and what it might mean, goes deeper than anyone in the mainstream is willing to say out loud. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you have to go back. All the way back. Not just to Ethiopia, not just to the medieval period when the Chapel of the Tablet was constructed, but to the moment the Ark itself first appears in the ancient record, and the terrifying power it was said to carry. The biblical account is unambiguous. According to the book of Exodus, the Ark of the Covenant was constructed under the direct instruction of God, relayed through Moses during the 40 years of wandering in the Sinai desert, roughly the 13th century BC by most scholarly estimates. It was built from acacia wood, overlaid entirely in gold, and sealed with a lid called the mercy seat. Two golden cherubim facing each other, their wings arching overhead. The dimensions given in Exodus are precise: 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 wide, 1.5 tall. Scholars have debated what those measurements translate to in modern terms, roughly 4 feet by 2.5 feet. But what the text claims it contained is far more significant than its size. Inside, according to the scriptural record, were 3 objects: the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, inscribed by the hand of God, a golden jar containing manna from the wilderness, and Aaron's rod that had miraculously budded. The ark was not merely a container. The text describes it to men who simply reached out to steady it when it tilted, struck down immediately. That's the origin. A portable throne for the most powerful force in the universe, according to the tradition that built Western civilization's religious foundation. For roughly 3 centuries, the Ark traveled with the Israelites. It reportedly crossed the Jordan River. It reportedly circled Jericho before the walls collapsed. It reportedly sat in the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the tabernacle, and later Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, where only the high priest could enter, and only once per year, on Yom Kippur. Then, somewhere around 586 BC, the Babylonian forces of Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem and razed the temple to the ground, and the Ark vanished. The Babylonian records of the temple spoils, which are remarkably detailed, do not mention it. It simply disappears from the historical record. That absence has haunted scholars for 2,600 years. Dr. James Hoffmeyer, a professor of Old Testament and Near Eastern archaeology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, who has spent decades excavating in Egypt and analyzing the intersection of biblical narrative and archaeological evidence, the Ark, if present, would have been at the top of that list. Its absence from the record demands explanation. That explanation, according to the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, is straightforward. The Ark was never in the temple when Babylon arrived. It had already been removed, centuries earlier, according to their tradition, and brought to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian account traces back to one of the most ancient texts in that tradition, the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, a 14th century compilation that its adherents believe preserves far older oral traditions. According to the Kebra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba, known in the Ethiopian tradition as Makeda, visited Solomon in Jerusalem around the 10th century BC. From that union, a son was born. Menelik Farfur, who later traveled to Jerusalem, met his father and, depending on the version of the account, either received the Ark as a gift or, according to some readings, arranged for it to be secretly transported back to Ethiopia in his retinue. The church maintains that the Ark was brought to the island of Tana Kirkos on Lake Tana, where it remained for approximately 800 years before being transferred to Axum, specifically to the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, during the Christianization of the Axumite Empire in the 4th century AD. The Chapel of the Tablet, a small, unassuming structure adjacent to the main church in Axum, is where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains the Ark resides today. And this is where the tradition becomes genuinely chilling in its specificity, because this isn't a vague institutional claim. The Church has maintained, for well over 1,000 years, a single unbroken guardianship. One monk, selected from a pool of candidates by his predecessor, sworn to a lifelong vigil, who alone is permitted to enter the chapel and view what is kept inside. When that guardian dies, another takes his place. No outside access, no photographs, no independent verification of any kind. The curtain that covers the inner sanctum never moves for anyone else. Not for the Patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, not for foreign dignitaries, not for anyone. Dr. Stuart Munro Hay, the British archaeologist who conducted some of the most thorough academic investigations of Axumite history before his death in 2004, spent years researching the Ethiopian claim. His conclusions were carefully hedged, as good scholarship demands. In his work on the subject, Munro Hay acknowledged that the tradition is deeply embedded in Ethiopian national and religious identity, and that Axum's historical significance as one of the great civilizations of the ancient world lends the claim a degree of cultural authenticity that dismissive Western scholars have consistently underestimated. But he also noted, with equal honesty, that the complete inaccessibility of the chapel makes any archaeological assessment impossible. That inaccessibility, he wrote, cuts both ways. It neither confirms nor refutes the tradition. Professor Edward Ullendorf, one of the foremost Western scholars of Ethiopian studies in the 20th century, claimed to have briefly inspected the object inside the chapel during a visit in the 1940s. He later described it, controversially, as a wooden box and expressed skepticism about the Ethiopian identification. His account was disputed vigorously by Ethiopian Orthodox authorities and by other scholars who questioned whether Ullendorf had seen the same object the Church considers the Ark, or something else entirely. The episode only deepened the mystery. It didn't resolve it, and it left a disturbing question hanging in the air. If even a trained academic who claims to have seen the object came away unconvinced, what would it take to actually know? That question, what would it take to actually know, is precisely what makes the reports from early 2026 so unsettling. Here's where the official story starts to fracture. In January of 2026, according to circulating accounts that no mainstream outlet has been able to independently verify, a document began passing through informal networks connecting Ethiopian Orthodox diaspora communities, independent historians, and a small number of archaeologists with regional specializations. The document, described by those who reportedly saw it as a first-hand account written by someone within proximity of the monastery, alleged that a significant event had taken place at the Chapel of the Tablet late in 2025. The details in the account were specific enough to attract serious attention, and disturbing enough to silence more than a few researchers who read it. Reports circulated that the current guardian of the Ark, an elderly monk who, according to sources familiar with the monastery's internal affairs, had held the position for more than 2 decades, had, under circumstances that remain entirely unclear, permitted or facilitated something that had never occurred in the chapel's recorded history. Sources allege that for the first time in the modern era, something inside the chapel was either examined, documented, or in some capacity accessed in a manner that departed from the strictly maintained tradition of total isolation. Dr. Miriam Feleke, an Ethiopian-born historian of ancient Semitic cultures, currently affiliated with a research institute in Addis Ababa, reportedly received a copy of the circulating document through a colleague in January 2026. According to an account passed through academic channels, she read it twice, set it down on her desk, and did not speak for nearly a full minute. When a colleague asked her what she thought, she allegedly said only, "If even half of this is accurate, nothing I've published in the last 15 years still holds." That reaction was not unique. What happened next shocked even the skeptics. According to the reported document, what was allegedly observed, and the language here matters enormously, because no independent verification exists, and these are circulated claims, not confirmed facts, was not the empty wooden box that Ullendorf had described. Sources allege the object described in the account bore characteristics consistent with ancient construction techniques of the late Bronze Age Levant, specific joinery methods, material composition, and surface treatment that no medieval craftsman in Ethiopia would have had reason to replicate or even knowledge to invent. The account reportedly described a craftsmanship so precise, so deliberately executed, that one scholar who reviewed the second-hand description allegedly remarked that it resembled nothing so much as the specifications in Exodus, down to dimensions that corresponded, within acceptable margins, to the measurements in the biblical text. Think about that for a second. Not as a supernatural claim, not as proof of anything, but as a historical puzzle. If reports accurately reflect what was allegedly observed, the object inside that chapel is either genuinely ancient, of Levantine origin, and consistent with the biblical description, or someone constructed an extraordinarily sophisticated replica at some unknown point in history, for reasons that no historian has been able to explain. Neither answer is comfortable. To understand why that matters, we need to go back to what the ark was said to do. The biblical accounts of the ark's power are not metaphorical. They're presented as historical record. The Philistines, who captured the ark in battle around 1050 BC, according to the scriptural timeline, reportedly suffered outbreaks of tumors and plague wherever it was kept. They returned it. The Israelites who looked inside it at Beth Shemesh, and the number given in the text is startling, over 50,000 people reportedly died. When King David attempted to bring the ark to Jerusalem, a man named Uzzah steadied it when the oxen pulling it stumbled, and according to the account, died instantly on contact. Modern readers read these accounts as ancient mythology, but some researchers who approach the text with different assumptions have made a disturbing observation. Dr. Ivan Panin, a 19th-century mathematician turned biblical scholar, and more recently, Dr. John Hutchison, a Canadian physicist who has studied anomalous electromagnetic effects, have both, from very different disciplinary starting points, raised the question of whether the biblical descriptions of the ark's effects are consistent with certain electromagnetic phenomena. Their work is speculative, contested, and not representative of mainstream scientific consensus. But the question itself is unsettling. Is it possible that what the ancients were describing was something they had no language to explain? Something that produced real, observable, physical effects that got encoded into theological narrative because that was the only framework available? This is where the evidence tells a different story from the one we've been handed. The construction specifications in Exodus have attracted attention from researchers with engineering backgrounds for a specific reason. The ark, as described, is essentially a gold-plated wooden box with a gold lid, positioned in a specific orientation in a specific climate, with specific materials touching its surface. Dr. Aryeh Kaplan, an Orthodox rabbi and physicist who wrote extensively on the intersection of Jewish mystical tradition and modern science before his death in 1983, argued in several papers that the materials and construction of the ark, as described in Exodus, would theoretically produce a significant electrostatic charge under specific conditions, particularly the dry, static-prone conditions of the Sinai Desert. His analysis suggested that the forbidden touch tradition surrounding the ark might have had a very practical physical basis. Kaplan was careful to frame this not as proof of anything supernatural, but as an observation that the tradition preserves information that is either remarkably prescient or was directly informed by actual experience with an unusual object. His work was largely ignored by mainstream scholars, but it has never been refuted. The 7 tiers of evidence that researchers have assembled around the Ethiopian claim form a structure that is either genuinely compelling or a remarkable confluence of coincidence. The physical evidence, the chapel itself, the documented history of the guardianship, the consistent descriptions from the few accounts that exist, is real and verifiable. The documentary evidence, including the Kebra Nagast and the Aksumite Royal Chronicles, places the tradition in a historical and cultural context that predates the medieval period of its written compilation. The testimonial evidence, fragmentary and hedged as it must be, includes accounts from Ethiopian clergy, diaspora scholars, and the occasional outside observer, none of which contradict each other in their core claims about the chapel's contents. What happened next left researchers speechless, because the alleged 2026 reports, according to sources, described something that none of them had a framework to process. The account reportedly included observations about the condition of the object. Not damage, not decay, something that multiple scholars who reviewed the second-hand description apparently found harder to explain than a simple ancient artifact would be. The object was allegedly described as being in a state of preservation inconsistent with its reported age. Not pristine, not immaculate, but preserved in a way that raised questions about storage conditions, about material science, about what 3,000 years actually does to ancient wood and gold when kept in a specific environment with specific ritual protocols consistently maintained. Dr. Johannes Tsegaye, an Ethiopian materials scientist and historian of ancient craft traditions, reportedly reviewed the circulating account at the request of colleagues in early 2026. According to sources familiar with his reaction, he spent 2 days examining the reported descriptions before concluding that, if accurate, they warranted serious and immediate scholarly attention, a phrase that, in academic circles, translates roughly to, "This is disturbing, and I don't know what to do with it." Tsegaye has not made any public statement on the matter. No independent verification of his assessment exists, but his reported silence on the public record, from a researcher known for prolific commentary on Ethiopian heritage topics, has itself been noted as conspicuous by colleagues. Here's what they're not telling you. Or more precisely, here's what nobody is saying on the record, because nobody can. The reports that circulated in 2026 have not been confirmed, denied, or addressed by any official body. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained its customary silence on all matters relating to the chapel and its contents. The Ethiopian government, which has historically been protective of Axum's status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a cornerstone of national identity, has issued no statement. International archaeological bodies have not called for investigation or access. The academic response has been, in the precise clinical language of the field, a conspicuous absence of response. And that silence is, in its own way, the most unsettling piece of evidence in this entire account. Because silence can mean many things. It can mean the reports are false and not worth dignifying. It can mean institutional caution in the face of unverified claims. It can mean political sensitivity around a site that sits at the intersection of national sovereignty, religious authority, and potential international attention. Or, and this is the question that keeps researchers awake, it can mean that enough of the right people have seen enough of the circulating account to understand that any public engagement with it opens a door that cannot easily be closed. Why now? Why 2026? Why would something that has been sealed for 3,000 years, according to this tradition, suddenly become accessible in any form at this specific moment in history? Those questions don't have public answers. They may not have private ones either. But the timing is not without context. The last 2 decades have seen a remarkable convergence of factors bearing on the Axum question. The Ethiopian civil conflict that ravaged the Tigray region between 2020 and 2022 brought the country's northern highlands, including Axum, into the center of international attention and, at various points, direct military action. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion was reportedly damaged during that conflict, and concerns about the safety of the chapel and its contents circulated widely in the Ethiopian diaspora and in international heritage preservation communities. According to multiple reports at the time, clergy made preparations for the potential emergency relocation of the chapel's contents, though no confirmation exists that any such relocation occurred. Whether those preparations or the conflict that prompted them contributed in any way to the alleged events of late 2025 remains entirely unknown. What we do know, what is documented, publicly available, and not in dispute, is this: Axum is real. The chapel is real. The Guardian tradition is real, documented by outside observers across multiple centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's claim to possess the Ark is not a fringe position within that tradition. It is the central, foundational claim of Ethiopian Christian national identity, maintained with absolute consistency for over 1,000 years, and no independent investigation of any kind has ever been permitted. That last fact bears examining in the context of modern parallels, because we live in an era when that kind of absolute, sustained institutional secrecy is almost without precedent. The Vatican archives, once essentially impenetrable, have been progressively opened to researchers. The Dead Sea Scrolls, fiercely controlled for decades, were eventually released for full scholarly access. Even the most sensitive classified government programs tend to leak within a generation. The Ethiopian guardianship of the chapel has held, without a single confirmed breach, of its inner sanctum for arguably over 1,500 years. Think about the institutional discipline that requires. Think about the generations of monks, each choosing his successor, each maintaining the same absolute barrier. That's not mythology. That's one of the most remarkable records of maintained secrecy in human history. And the question that raises, the disturbing, unavoidable question, is what would require that level of commitment? What would you guard that way? What would justify the cost, across centuries and political upheavals and wars and famines, of maintaining one man alone as the sole interface between the world and whatever is inside that room? Scholars have different answers. Dr. Robert Cornick, an American biblical archaeologist and founder of the Base Institute, who has conducted fieldwork relating to Ark-related sites in Ethiopia, has argued in his research that the Ethiopian tradition is far more historically credible than Western scholarship has generally acknowledged. He doesn't claim certainty. His work is consistently framed as investigative rather than conclusive, but he has documented physical and historical evidence suggesting that the route described in the Kebra Nagast is geographically and archaeologically plausible in ways that have been consistently underestimated. Professor Graham Hancock, the author whose 1992 work on the Ethiopian Ark claim brought the subject to mass public attention, has argued more forcefully that the convergence of historical, documentary, and physical evidence pointing to Axum is too substantial to dismiss. His work has been criticized by mainstream archaeologists for overreaching its evidence, and that criticism is not without merit. But even his critics have generally acknowledged that his underlying research into the Ethiopian tradition was thorough, and that the tradition itself deserves more serious scholarly engagement than it has typically received. The prophetic dimension of this question, and we should approach it with appropriate caution, is not something researchers in the secular academic tradition typically address. But the connection between the Ark's reported location and biblical prophecy relating to end-times events has been a persistent undercurrent in theological circles for centuries. Several passages in the Hebrew Bible, most notably in Jeremiah and in Revelation, have been interpreted by some scholars as pointing toward the Ark's eventual rediscovery or re-emergence as a harbinger of significant religious and geopolitical change. It would be overstating the case to treat those interpretations as predictions. Scholars who work in this space are clear that prophetic texts are not historical forecasts in any straightforward sense. But the fact that 2026 reports of alleged changes at the chapel arrived at a moment of extraordinary geopolitical tension in the broader Middle East, at a moment when questions of religious sovereignty over ancient sites are more politically charged than they have been in decades, is something that multiple commentators have noted without knowing what to make of it. Why do reports like this emerge when they do? What drives the moment when something sealed and forbidden and ancient crosses from the realm of tradition into something that starts generating first-hand accounts and academic reactions and institutional silence all at once? Is it coincidence? Is it the information environment of the modern era, which makes the circulation of unverified documents faster and wider than ever before? Or is it something else, something in the calm nature of secrets themselves, which tend, eventually, toward surfacing? The question barrage isn't rhetorical. These are the actual questions that researchers are reportedly sitting with right now, without public answers and without a pathway to get them. What exactly was the nature of the alleged event in late 2025? Who had access? What was documented, if anything? What did the guardian monk, in the last years of a lifelong vigil, decide to allow, and why? And if the reports bear any relationship to what actually occurred, what does that mean for the 3,000 years of silence that preceded it? No one outside the chapel knows. And here is the truly chilling part. It's entirely possible that the guardian himself is the only living person who does. One man, one room, one object. That's the entire information architecture of this mystery, and it has held for longer than the Roman Empire lasted, longer than Christianity has existed in its current form, longer than almost any institutional tradition in the world. The midday glare on the tin roofs in Axum is just as bright as it was 100 years ago. The incense still drifts. The curtain at the chapel entrance still doesn't move. Whatever is behind it, whatever the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has protected with singular devotion across a span of time that beggars comprehension, is still there, still sealed, so far as anyone outside can confirm. Still guarded by one man whose name most of the world doesn't know. And somewhere, according to the reports that circulated in early 2026, somewhere in that gap between what is claimed and what can be verified, between what was allegedly observed and what was never meant to be seen, something shifted. Something that silenced researchers who spent their careers not believing. Something that prompted institutional silence from people and organizations that typically have answers for everything. Something that made historians who built entire bodies of work on the assumption that this tradition was folklore pause in the middle of their certainty and go very, very quiet. That silence is where we are right now. One chapel in Axum, one guardian monk, one report that broke a 3,000-year silence. No independent verification exists. No official statement has been made. No outside researcher has been permitted access. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church continues to maintain its claim with the same absolute consistency it has maintained for 15 centuries. And the experts, the scholars and archaeologists and historians who built careers on the assumption that they already knew how this story ended, remain, for now, speechless. Whatever is inside that chapel, whether it is the object described in Exodus or something else entirely, whether the alleged events of 2026 are accurate, distorted, or wholly invented, the silence speaks. It spoke 3,000 years ago in the Holy of Holies. It spoke across the centuries of the guardian tradition, and it's speaking now in the measured, careful, haunted quiet of researchers who encountered something they weren't prepared for. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and some silences, once broken, say everything.